Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Gorman from Wellness in Motion, or at Scoliosis and Back Care for social media purposes. And I'm here with Carlyn Porter of The Curvy Truth and Martha Carter of Twisted Outreach Projects and Julie Wilkins of Forever Fused. And we're here to talk about yoga with a spinal fusion, which I think is a fun and exciting topic. We can cover so much. But let's start first with is there one word that you could use to summarize your scoliosis spinal fusion experience and maybe elaborate on what the last 10 years has been like in this journey? Does anyone want to start with that question? Okay, I'll start with the question because it's not an easy question, of course. There's so many different aspects, but I think if I would choose one word about my experience with scoliosis spinal fusion, it would be evolving. I think that it's always evolving, and that's particularly what I'm interested in these days about how the experience changes as the timeline goes out from the point of surgery. And for me, what that means in the last 10 years, really the last 10 years is the beginning of when I started to learn about my scoliosis and my spinal fusion. I had my surgery when I was 11. I was pretty young, and I'm a selective thoracic fusion. So my fusion is from T3 to T10. And I kind of understood that I was like at more risk for back things, but that was really all I understood. And so the last 10 years has been this journey, which actually started with yoga, about learning about the scoliosis, because I think in my experience, even though I'm fused, I still have a left lumbar curve. And even in my thoracic, there's still rotation that can increase or decrease depending upon what I do with my ribs and my shoulders and my arms. So the last 10 years for me has just been really a learning adventure about scoliosis and spinal fusions. And I've changed a lot of my movement practices in the last 10 years to kind of accommodate both my body changes and also my understanding and my new awareness. So it's been interesting in that aspect. So,
well, Jen, I think I'll expand on your story because I too had my surgery young. So I was 12, and that was in 1988. I'm fused T3 to L3 with the Cottrell Dubussé instrumentation, which was fairly new at that time, just post Harrington rod time frame. And so I would say my word would be insightful for sure. The last 10 years for me, and it's kind of strange because I'm 45 and I had my surgery at 12. Like, I don't remember a life without a spinal fusion. So pretty much my entire life I've had this body, and now I'm just dealing with an aging body and a fusion and, trying to pull those two pieces together. But what I've really learned over the last 10 years is from learning from other people who've had fusions, particularly different level fusions, fused with Harrington rods from the 70s and 80s, people that have had, like Martha will share, have decided to remove their instrumentation, have revision surgeries. And in some ways it's been terrifying, but also insightful to hear these stories of how the fusions are holding up for those of us who are 30 years out. And that has been really revealing to me, like, how am I going to take care of my body for the long run? I might have a lot of years that I've got to go with this body, this spine, and what is that going to look like? And how can I best serve myself for my 90-year-old self? So,
yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And Julie, what's so interesting is as you started to speak, I'm just now realizing that were the same age, and we had our surgery in the same year.
Oh, wow.
I have a Harrington rod because the CD method was so new, and I was in Idaho, pretty remote. We looked at some options in California, but it was our decision at that point. Like, do you go with the old or the new?
Right. Well, Jen, it's funny you say that because I'm in Southern Alabama. I was in Mobile, Alabama, and this new young surgeon came in and took over the practice of the only pediatric orthopedic surgeon in town and must have been trained with CD rods. And I mean, I'd say I probably got lucky, really lucky, because the Harringtons had had more complications, and I've done fairly well with the CD rods. I'm having various things I have to deal with, like we all will, but yeah, thank you for making that connection there.
Yeah. Great. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just add my story. I'm older. I had my surgery in 74. There was no choice except to have the Harrington rods, and there wasn't a lot of knowledge around it at the time. It was a fairly new surgery at that time. I think it started maybe in the 60s, but they didn't really start to be commonly done in Canada, that's for sure, until the 70s. And so I've started to understand that really in some ways, one of the most important things to understand for other people is when was your surgery done and what was the procedure? Because it occurs to me that most of the people I meet now are younger and have had kind of newer, like you're saying, the Cottrell Dubisset or other procedures with perhaps a little bit more mindfulness around body work and physiotherapy directly after the surgery. Whereas in the early days, they were so cautious that my generation, we lay in bed for the better part of a year in a plaster body cast. Mm. And that I have learned to understand is probably been the hardest part of my experience compared to, well, I shouldn't compare. It's not about comparing. It's about realizing that long bed stay caused probably more problems than the surgery alone. Right. So yeah. The new understanding of getting up and keeping the body strong, not letting the muscles atrophy, keeping the breathing happening, keeping, the body dynamic is a much better strategy for healing and a much safer way to work with the body to allow it to adjust quickly, allow it to adjust to its new fusion quickly. Whereas in my case, lying around in body casts that you couldn't remove was so hard. And I atrophied so much, I had to learn to walk again, which of course is terrible for supporting the spine. So I was like having to rehab a bunch of stuff at once, not just the spine. And also I had so much scar tissue in my back, all around the spine and the fusion, that it was the scar tissue that was causing the problems for many, many years until I managed to get the right massage therapist to help me remove that. And that took 10 years to remove, basically. So on my journey, I'm not even talking about the last 10 years because mine is so old. And so I actually chose to have the rods removed 21 years after they were in. I had this instinct that I was not going to be able to get better unless I got rid of the instrumentation. It just felt like I wasn't able to get inside my body to help myself. And it was kind of like I was having nightmares. I was having rod nightmares. And I just had to face that and kind of find a way to have the rods removed, which is a standard procedure in some countries I've learned, but it's definitely not standard in North America to remove instrumentation. And that I think these things we can't do both, right? You can't do the instrumentation and then not do it and then put it back in, or, you just try one way and that's your path. So my path, after I removed the rods, I had so much physio, I had so much massage therapy to get to a place of just having some awareness of openness and movement again. And that took, like I said, 10 years, which took me to about 2005. And then I started to discover alternative body work like yoga. So it was many, many steps for me to even get to the yoga. And then I could now it's definitely an ongoing evolution, that's for sure. But the word I use constantly is a confounding condition. It's just a confounding condition. You cannot compare yourself to someone else. And every single situation is so unique that everyone is required to kind of figure it out on their own. Sure, we can help each other, and sure, we can learn from each other, but we really can't expect one person's experience to be able to mirror another person's experience, and it's certainly not in rehab or in any kind of physicality. So I feel like to get through the confounding part is to stay curious and stay positive as much as possible, and then just keep staying kind of staying active. That's really, there's no other way around it but to stay active.
Yeah, the curious piece has come up with other people that I've spoken to with spinal fusions, because staying curious has the potential to help you find a path, I think. Yeah.
Well, and also when you're not, like when I was so stuck and kind of miserable, I reached a point of, I guess you would call it a bit of a breakdown, an emotional breakdown. And I knew it was related to my back. I couldn't even take a deep breath. My ribs were so locked, but I didn't understand that that's what's happening at the time. It's just every bit of my body just was like, I need to do something to change this. Otherwise, I knew I just couldn't thrive. So learning to follow those instincts as well, and then finding support for them is not always easy. How many times have I heard fused folks say, well, I'm having issues, I'm going to go talk to my surgeon about it. It's like, well, I'm not sure the surgeon has much to tell you, because they don't make suggestions necessarily that are constructive, and they don't have fusion, so they don't really know how you're feeling. So to figure it out on your own and to listen to your own self is a huge learning curve.
Martha, I just want to ask a quick question before we move on, because since you shared had the instrumentation removed, people ask this question all the time. They think that removing the instrumentation will give them more mobility, but my understanding is the fusion that's giving you the lack of mobility, not necessarily the instrumentation. The instrumentation can give you other problems, but what was your experience mobility-wise?
I think the big key for me was the scar tissue. So once I was able to get my ribs moving again and opening again and being able to take a deep breath again, then I started to feel tremendous amount of increased mobility. But it wasn't because I didn't have a fusion. Of course, I still had a fusion. My spine was still stiff, but the rest of my body became more supple again. So that's, once again, something I don't see happening as much. Rather, that extreme stiffness is always there to a certain degree, but I don't see the locked ribs happening with people who are having surgery in contemporary times, because they get up and walk a few days after the surgery. So they don't develop the scar tissue to the same degree. And I also think that the Harrington rods were known, as you pointed out, to have a much bigger failure rate. And so I think a lot of the folks of my generation have had to have their rods looked at or changed or removed, because they actually pop out and have other issues that the newer surgeries are certainly much more stable in general.
Yeah. And Julie, that's my understanding as well, is that the instrumentation is there to secure the bone grafting and the fusion as it's fusing, as the bone becomes one. And then the instrumentation just stays there, but the bone is fused.
Right.
So, yeah. So kind of what both of you said is my understanding as well, as far as.
And so, I think that working through the stiffness is such an important detail, right? Is to, and we can get into that more, but I want to hear Carlyn's story too.
I'm loving hearing. I'm learning so much from this conversation. So my word was unfolding, and I had my fusion in 2000. And that's another interesting thing of this conversation, is like how ours are similar and different based on when we had them done. So mine, I'm fused L1 to L4. So my lumbar is fused, and my thoracic, I still have a curve there, but that's not fused. And I requested my records and they sent me my doctor's notes. And so I got to read how he was unsure which he was going to fuse and how he referred to my lumbar as like bizarre. But yeah, so that's where I'm fused. And what I've learned over the last 10 years is I've learned how to listen to the way that my body communicates and not focus so much on what my curves are doing, but actually use that as feedback to better understand how I'm responding to what's going on in my life, and looking at paying attention to the soft tissue, the connective tissue. And what got me to that point was, I think it was around 10 years after my fusion, I started reaching out to orthopedic surgeons because my surgeon suggested having it looked at every so many years. So I reached out to them and no one would see me because they're like, unless you're having pain or if you have, an issue, we don't do that. And so I'm like out here like, okay, well, what do I do? How do I make sure that I'm taking care of my body? And that's what led me to like chiropractic, acupuncture. I confused physical therapists, so I didn't really work with them much. And then when I found my way to yoga, that's when I learned how to appreciate my body and listen to it and trust it and restore that connection, because I didn't have that before. And I felt like my body was kind of like working against me in some way. Like I didn't understand like why it was doing what it was doing. And I felt like I didn't have control. So now I feel like I'm able to connect my emotions to what the sensations in my body. And sometimes it doesn't feel good. And other times it's like I feel great and I feel relaxed. But I'm learning like how stress manifests, where I get like tension and tightness, and also be very forgiving and gentle. So when I was younger, I would say like late teens, early 20s, I liked more like running, more higher intensity. And now I'm a lot more gentle because I feel like that's what my body asks for. And that's what my body needs, is more like not that high intensity stuff, but like to be kind of, kinder to my joints. Because those kinds of movements is what works best for me.
And Carlyn, what first brought you to yoga?
I was living in Chicago at the time, and I think I just through Googling, I found DL Harity. She does yoga for scoliosis. And I crashed. She did this like tea talk for her students. And I totally crashed this tea talk because I didn't realize it was just for her students. And that's how I made that connection with her. And I learned more from her about my scoliosis in my body than from anyone else in my scoliosis journey. And so I started doing yoga for scoliosis as my start, as my intro into yoga. And then a few years later, I was diagnosed with autoimmunity. And so as I was exploring more gentle types like yin, that's when I really started to adopt it as an ongoing practice.
Cool. Nice. And for anyone watching, and also in case you ever want to find her, DL is going by Nancy Harity now. Okay. And she's moved to Indiana and is, I believe, living and working at a Buddhist retreat center. So she had a change this year, but she's a wonderful teacher.
She was amazing.
Yeah, good. So let's talk, we kind of, Carlyn started us off, but let's talk a little bit about when and why we started practicing yoga.
I'll mention, so it was about 20 years ago, and I did not come to yoga to work with my physical body initially at all. I had a very stressful job. I was a pediatric occupational therapist. I worked at a children's trauma hospital, and a studio opened up near my home in Mobile, Alabama. It was like one of the only studios and the first one anywhere in my area. And I just happened to walk in. I had been curious about yoga for a couple years, but I kind of thought, oh, well, that's not something I will ever be able to do. I mean, I told myself that. And I just decided I was going to go to this gentle evening candlelight class strictly for the stress benefits of that. And fortunately connected with the teacher, and it was gentle enough for me to muddle my way through it. And then as I kept going back, of course, I was met with my fusion. I mean, there's no choice in yoga, but you're just bumping up against your fused spine with the posture. So then, but the benefits of how I felt when I left the class were, and how my nervous system felt, was enough for me to take the steps that I needed to pursue. Okay, how am I going to figure this out? And how am I going to integrate this into my life? And then it just took off from there. And like, I took it to the extreme.
That's great. Martha, how did you discover yoga?
Well, along the way, I mean, I was a very enthusiastic young dancer, and had always loved ballet, actually, and had the long legs and I was just really into it when I had my surgery, and then I was told to never dance again, kind of thing. But as a kid, you're like, they're not serious about that, are they? They can't be serious about not dancing, kind of thing. So I took a few years before I started dancing again. I definitely couldn't keep doing the ballet, but I discovered modern dance and was in college, and I kind of just did that for several years, moving into doing choreography and directing dancers, because I couldn't really perform in any kind of there's different kinds of performance, obviously, but in terms of high level dancing, that really wasn't what my body could support, even though my heart wanted it. And so I really enjoyed teaching dance and working with bodies, and felt like I knew so much that of course I could do yoga, and of course I could still dance even though the doctors told me not to. Well, try that a few times and I kept hurting myself. And that's when you start to realize, oh, wait a second, at that time it was like, oh, poor me, there's something wrong with me, they messed me up. And I kind of got angry, and that led into what I talked about is the emotional breakdown and the removal of the rods, which basically was the beginning of what we would call the yoga journey, even though I specifically didn't do yoga because they told me not to do yoga. They being, the doctor powers that be, I was basically told to do nothing except for maybe walking and swimming. And it's like, well, that's not quite enough for me. So along the way, I would go back and try yoga because so many friends in dance did it. And of course, I was introduced to Pilates and all these other body works that dancers use just to keep themselves going. And though that was kind of thus opening into this place of, oh, I'm going to give myself permission to explore my spine and not necessarily listen to what they say, and to see what I can discover on my own. And yoga kept being the thing I couldn't get through because I would hurt myself, until I met a friend who said, look, I'm going to give you just a simple sequence and just work on that sequence, only that sequence. And for years, I just did that one little sequence, and it was still always difficult, but it gave me that sense of like, okay, less can be more. Just do something to take yourself in the direction of feeling better. And over time, I became comfortable enough to look into actually taking a yoga workshop, and I found Yoga for Scoliosis with Elise Browning Miller, which then led me to Samamkaya Yoga because she taught a workshop there, and I was living on the east coast of Canada at the time, so it was easy to get to. I did a few of those. I met Deborah Wolk. I started to tap into, say, the Yoga for Scoliosis community and understand that there was even yoga for fusions, which was like mind-blowing. And then that's when I decided to train in it myself, become a yoga teacher myself, take the Yoga for Scoliosis training myself. And that all happened starting about, I guess, 13 years ago is when I started to get serious into the Yoga for Scoliosis. And then now, of course, that just keeps opening into new possibilities. The word unfolding and evolution come to mind here, because the more I do for my own body and the more I discover for my own body, the more I'm understanding less is more. So that's like kind of a funny thing. But perhaps that's also because I'm a little older. I tend to have quite a few older clients. And like you said, Carlyn, we don't need to go jogging anymore. We really don't need to do impactful, aggressive, I guess exercise is the word, or even any kind of gaming or athletics, unless you're really feeling up to it. And some people are. But I find that a lot of folks are still learning what's a good day and what's a bad day. And you said it earlier, some days you just have to be more gentle and some days you can do more. But just to even learn to read yourself, to be safe. This is a day where I'm only doing the restorative stuff on the mat. I'm not going to do all the dynamic poses because it's just not the right day for it. Doesn't mean I can never do them, but I'm just not doing them today. And that has been a huge evolution for me. And I use the word give myself permission to take it easy, or give myself permission to try something a bit more intense and dynamic. It's like the extremes, and maybe we're always a little extreme because we're always finding, kind of the limits of what our body can handle. As people into movement, you want to keep finding movement, but then you're like, oh, well, that's a little too much movement.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate balance.
You have to swing the pendulum both ways to find where your middle is, and then as you age, that middle place seems to shift. So you have to explore both sides, I think, to figure out where you are.
Yeah. And just to add on one other bit, and I can talk about it more later if there's time, but I have now moved into what I'm calling somatic yoga as I study the Hana somatics technique, which is grounded in Feldenkrais and Alexander, basically, which are, very much somatic body practices, very related to yoga, but it's even kind of like foundational before yoga. It's kind of that learning to listen to your body in the most subtle ways that I am finding to be extremely helpful, especially for people with fusions, for all the reasons we've already been talking about.
Yeah. Great. I think that I found yoga probably about 20 years ago. And at the time, so my situation is almost the opposite of yours, Martha, because I was told I could do anything I wanted to except for gymnastics. That was my only limitation. And so I see this often, that people are told they can do anything they want. And I hear that people were told don't do anything. And again, it's that pendulum, and maybe somewhere in the middle is a little bit a better path. So I was dancing professionally in San Francisco, and I didn't know anything about my scoliosis. I didn't know anything about my spinal fusions. And at that time, I didn't really know much about cross training either. And so I went to yoga because I felt better when I was done. And quite honestly, like, I danced better. I think it probably just brought me to my center. And also because I was classically trained, yoga was a place where I was given permission to follow what my body wanted to do. And so I have no problem, like, because in ballet and in dance and choreography, you don't get that choice. So it was the one place where I could listen to my body, and that was a real gift. I didn't really learn how to modify my practice for my scoliosis and my spinal fusion and that unfused lumbar curve until I went on a path. I was really lucky. I was living in New York, and I knew something wasn't quite right because I had just done a show at the Kennedy Center, and my rib cage was just collapsing in all sorts of different ways. And that sent me on the path of trying to figure out my scoliosis and my spinal fusion, but through yoga. And it did, I think it was Carlyn that mentioned this. Yoga for me gave me back some agency and some control, because I had things that I could kind of troubleshoot and that could make me feel better. Not only physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. So, Now, several of us also teach people with spinal fusions. And so let's talk a little bit about how we approach that process. Julie, if you want to start.
Initially, I tried to find a one shop for everybody, one size fits all approach. And as I kind of learned how different people were with the time frames that they had their fusion, where they were fused, their age, their energetic conditioning, their physical conditioning, it's so dependent on the person. And probably one of my favorite people to come to me is someone who's fused, who's already gotten into yoga and maybe just needs to consult on, like, these poses don't feel good to me. What are the adaptations? And that's one of my favorite things to do, is adapt traditional poses for their fusion, wherever they're fused in their bodies. I love that. But, more lately, if I have somebody come to me in pain, I work with more like rehab-based approaches. So maybe even just less yoga and more therapeutic exercise and functional movement, and like, how are you sitting at your desk at work, and how can we adapt your office space for improved posture or better comfort, or even just teaching people how to pace their activities and not sit all day, and like get up every 20 minutes and move around, and have some tools at home to help to take care of their bodies better, and some self-care stuff. So it really varies as to who is coming to me and what their goals are.
Yeah, and I'll say, because I teach a weekly class, and I think it's hard because you have a lot of different people, but what's awesome is having this space where people are having different experiences, and I try to create a really open space so that people can bring things up, because it'll be beneficial for someone else in the room, and also beneficial for me as a teacher to hear a different story, and to hear a different experience. So in general, like when I'm teaching people with spinal fusions, I do teach a lot about the scoliosis and the concavities and the convexities. And the reason why is because in my experience, the spine is fused and the neuromuscular patterning hasn't changed. And so that's been very, very helpful for me, because we can still work with the ribs, and we can still elongate and expand. And then I love to be creative. So, I'm not afraid to take something that might be traditionally done on the stomach and do it standing at the wall. Just to modify and to adapt and to give different options, because it is really about people finding their own personal practice. And I do tend to teach, because many of my students are more along the therapeutics spectrum, that I do tend to teach more of postures in like working on stabilizing the spine and staying a little bit more neutral, a lot more neutral, actually. I don't teach many things in the traditional way. So, and Martha, how about you?
Well, yeah, I think that all the above. In general, I consider my approach to be kind of a more multidisciplinary approach. And I also really enjoy bringing in kind of the creative movement or creativity in the movement. Coming from dance and loving freestyle movement, I find is a great thing to introduce to fusioneers, because there's that sense of just flowing in your own way. Right. Just so turning on the music and dancing around is something I haven't done all year because it does not work well on Zoom. But in real life, it's a wonderful way to get the heart rate up. It just basically enjoying moving through space is something I'd like to introduce regularly with fusion situations. However, I also go to the other extreme and on the floor, very gentle, restorative, therapeutic, somatic movements are the best way I find for people to really get to know themselves and what's going on for them, what feels safe to them, get to know how their various bits are moving in a very, very specific way and concentrated way, so that, does the right shoulder move the same as the left shoulder? Guess what? It probably doesn't. So once you are able to get people aware of where they're at, sure, get to know their curve pattern, know where their fusion is, but more than that, know exactly how their body's moving today, then you can get into more dynamic poses. And I think that a lot of people love the more dynamic poses because they do feel more rigorous, and they feel stronger afterwards. And they're, to be part of the language of yoga gives them inroads to try all different kinds of classes once they know how to be safe. So I encourage kind of that full spectrum, from the full-on freestyle to the very concentrated focus. And then I find that the general yoga practice is somewhere in the middle of both those two extremes. And I find a hybrid class is useful because then you can do all of those things in one class. But sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes just, keeping it simpler is better. So I subscribe to that toolbox, having the toolbox. And so that I have the toolbox as a teacher, and then I encourage the students to kind of choose the exercises they like, and think about them in terms of which ones they might reach for when they're home to support their day-to-day. And then they have something to do for themselves on a regular basis, even if they're not doing full classes or full practices. Yeah. So the variety approach, perhaps.
And Carlyn, what different types of yoga have you explored, and how has that exploration process been for you?
So with the first one being yoga for scoliosis, gosh, and I always forget like what branch that ties to, but I know it's like a lot more about like using props and alignment's really important.
So Yangar based.
Yes. So having that start helped me as I explored other types. So when I did, I think like vinyasa, where it's more like flowy, I felt comfortable using my blocks because of what I learned in my YFS classes, and taking my time. So I would say I had to be comfortable showing up and honoring what my body wanted to do. And one of my friends, she is a yoga teacher in Colorado, and she told me, she's like, everything that the instructor says is a suggestion. So I could not move as quickly as everyone else as they're going from one, pose to another. And so I learned how to follow my own rhythms and be okay, that what I'm doing on my mat is looking a little different, and feeling like, I think that understanding that that's a good thing. Like yoga teachers want you to do that, because then you're really listening and you're in tune with what your body needs.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I'm glad you said that, Carlyn, because that was one of the things that drew me to yoga. It was encouraged, at least in the classes I went to do what feels right for your body today, and that just to be given permission in a group class environment. Like I did aerobics for years prior to yoga, and as I was trying to learn about my body, it was like, wow, the teacher gave me permission to do what feels right. I'm going to take that as it is. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I don't know. I've had some other experiences other than that, with the teachers being very, very demanding and kind of belittling. And before I knew how to advocate for myself, I got myself into some really tricky situations where I was trying to do things I should never have been trying to do because of the sense of pressure as a student to try to keep up. So to get to a place where you're at, Carlyn, where you're like, I'm fine, I'm doing my own thing, it doesn't matter if I'm the same as everyone else, that took me years to get to. And I think it's related to what Jen said earlier. In dance, you don't have those choices. In dance, you're keeping up with the crowd, otherwise you're out, if otherwise someone's running into you. So to learn to go into the yoga class, I recommend to folks to find your own space close to a wall, in the back perhaps, so that if you have to get up and get another prop, you're not disturbing anybody. And that if you have to lie down and not do anything for a moment because it's too rigorous, then you're not, right in the sight of everybody, that you're kind of a little off to the side. And that I like to use the wall. I like to have the support of lots of props around me, and just knowing that I have all those choices is important if I'm taking a general class, especially if I've never taken a class before. And there are some studios that don't encourage props at all, right? Depending on the style of the yoga. And I don't think those are the studios that fusioneers are meant to go to.
Yeah. And I think that, what we're all talking about too is that it's really important, if you're on a yoga path, to find someone that's going to work with you and listen to you, and who not only says to follow your own body, but then truly means that.
Right. And so I think it's good to bring up that people who are new to yoga may not realize there's many different styles and
Thank
teachers.
you, Julie.
And I'm glad Martha mentioned that. I have experienced some militant, demanding, intimidating yoga teachers. Definitely not a good space for anyone. Well, I mean, anyone dealing with trauma, all of us have had body trauma. And, to just come into a place where we're trying to soften into our bodies and feel our bodies, you really need a teacher that is going to reflect that as your primary goal for going to classes. So keep looking around and trying different styles and places.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think people are generally pretty safe if they choose a therapeutic class or a beginner class or a restorative class. However, all of those classes can involve twisting. That is not always a good idea. If you're not sure what you're doing with fusion, you need to be very careful always, but especially with anything twisting. So, slower, easier, the better, until one is familiar with it. And of course, if you have the opportunity to work with somebody who knows scoliosis and or fusions, then that's always better. And I also recommend to people to take a private to get started. Yeah. If they've never done it before, take a private or 2 or 10 until they're more comfortable with what's going on for them before they jump into a general class.
But most teachers will probably not understand long fusions. Would you agree, Martha? Just your general yoga teacher?
Most teachers don't understand scoliosis or fusions.
Correct. That's what I believe as well. And in fact, I used to think, and I'm in a different situation because my fusion is just my thoracic. I used to think that if I said I'm fused T3 through T10, people knew what that meant.
I thought so too.
Now what I say, and I think it's important, like I would love to hear how you all phrase this. I say, because even physical therapists, I can say that to, and they don't get it. So I say I'm fused from T3 through T10. That part of my spine doesn't move. There's also a metal rod in there. And I have a lumbar left scoliosis curve that is rotating. So I try to give as much. Yes, tell me, Julie.
Yes, this is what you do, everyone. Not like what Jen said, but let me tell you an even easier way. You have a picture of your x-ray on your phone.
Yes.
And you just say, let me just show you this. And all you got to do is show them. And then they're like, okay. I mean, you don't even have to say anymore. I've had to do that to physical therapists, physicians, Pure Barre instructors, you name it. Like because I originally, like you, Jen, would try to tell them, and I'd use that terminology. I have a spinal fusion for childhood scoliosis and blah, 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 blah. And they were just like not getting it at all. But when I started to show the x-ray, I got a lot more attention. Clearly, it's going to be a shocker. And usually they're intimidated. And I usually say, I'm very comfortable taking care of myself. You don't have to worry about me. I just may be doing things a little differently. And this applies to any group class I might go to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, Julie, what is I'm just going to point this out and pull it out, is that having imaging, and also if you're able to, getting that report from your surgery can be really helpful.
Yes, always get your records.
Yes, get your records.
Always,
get your
you
records.
have the right to ask for your medical records, all of them, your x-rays. I mean, I'm so far out now, I couldn't get my records anymore from my surgery, but I would have loved to have had that. So, I mean, if you're close enough from your surgery, get all that information in your possession.
Great.
Yeah,
we have someone in the audience that was also saying that she likes to show her x-rays to her physical therapist, and same thing. Sometimes you think someone in the medical, a clinician will understand, but a visual is so valuable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Carlyn.
Oh, no, it's okay. I just wanted to echo just how important it is to get your records, get your x-rays, because I waited past that point and they told me that they were destroyed. And I'm thinking, for a condition that they don't really understand very well, why on earth would you destroy these records?
Yeah.
That's just...
So, Carlyn, one really easy way, I don't use chiropractors. And some people do, and they have great success with that, but it's super easy to go and do an initial consult, ask to not have any adjustments done, and just they'll take your x-rays. If your insurance covers it, you can easily get x-rays, and sometimes it's just easier than going to the orthopedic surgeon for all that too. So I've done that to get recent x-rays myself.
That's really smart. I did have one chiropractor he did that with all of his patients before working with them.
Yeah, they usually do.
And I liked the way that he put it. He's like, there's your hardware. And I'm like, oh, that's so cute.
But I also think it's helpful for each individual to have it, to look at themselves and to absorb for themselves where it is for them to for us to be able to sense it. And you see, I understand now. I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to know that that's what had been done to me when I was 14. I wanted to keep dancing. I wanted to pretend it wasn't in there. So there was surely no meditation being done around the level of my fusion and the size of my curves or any of that. I was just pretend it's not there. And I think that's quite common for people when they get it done as teenagers, because you're generally pretty resilient and you don't necessarily have discomfort right away. And there's a sense of just kind of wanting to get on with your life after years of braces and whatnot. And then, you get into these old, into an older, wiser place, and you start to go, wait a second, what exactly happened? And that's when I wanted to get my x-rays. Of course, those records were gone. So I did have fresh ones done when I had the rods removed and all that. And just to start to really take in what it is that is in my body, and then to be able to take that image and superimpose it into my own sensation. It was a huge learning curve. And so it's great to be able to show it to the doctors too, but that I feel is part of the journey for each person as they get into their yoga or into whatever body work and physiotherapies that they want to face, is not just rely on the doctor you're showing it to understand it. It's like it's one thing to say the numbers, it's another thing to feel the numbers.
Right.
And I'm kind of amazed at how many people don't seem to know which way their curve goes. And I'm like, how could you not feel that? But I didn't for a long time. So that is also something I encourage people to face it. And it's not necessarily that easy, because there is trauma or emotional memory in there that isn't always necessarily a positive thing, especially for folks who had it done young. I often hear that, we didn't have a say over it. I didn't have much say over it. It was sort of what the doctors and my parents decided. Sure, a few teenagers decide they don't want it and they stand up to the system. I wasn't that kind of kid. I was like, okay, whatever you say, I'll do it. And I feel that that was kind of a huge, revelation 21 years later to understand what had happened. So maybe I was just really slow, but I don't think I'm the only one that ends up seeing it that way or not seeing it. And also the level of trauma, the word trauma came up. One thing I've become interested in this last little while is how many imprints do we have in our bodies of our spine? We grew up with a relatively straight spine. Then at some point, it goes off. And then you have either traction or braces or something. And it's like, okay, how about that? How's that feel? And then at some point, the doctors open us up, adjust our spine, and fuse it into yet another position. And it's like, oh, okay, so where's my plumb line? Where is my curve? Where was it? Where is it now? So I feel that was something that Hagit actually said in your discussion with her, how people get fused, but they still feel their old curve.
Mm-hmm.
The old curve is still
Martha,
there.
Or, I mean, I'm fused with curves.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in 1988, I see the x-rays of people who've had their fusions more recently, and their spines are so incredibly straight, and they could not get that level of correction. I think I have a 14-degree thoracic and 23-degree lumbar, maybe more now. At one point, it was measured that way. And so that was the best they could do. And that's
me too.
That's frustrating for me. I look in the mirror, I see my right hip higher, I see my right scapula out. They weren't able to get the rotational correction then either. So, but I'm stuck there. I mean, there's nothing. I have a fused curved spine that, well, it is what it is. It was better than what the outcome would have been, I guess, had I not had that done. So
that is a very good point, that a lot of us they do not get full correction. They rarely get full correction. Yet I have been seeing those very straight teenage spines online, and they're kind of shocking. And I'd be curious to see how they settle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's the thing. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just to remember, my mother, apparently, because I wouldn't have remembered any of this, my mother she freaked out because in the weeks following my surgery, she saw collapse.
Mm-hmm.
So they were no longer bracing or body casting like Martha. And I don't know, Jen, if you were body casted with your Harrington.
I had a brace for 6 months after.
So they were not doing that
That's
anymore.
interesting.
The reason they were doing that was because the spine takes a time to fuse. So in those weeks following surgery, I was collapsing back to the curve, and my mother saw it happening and just called in a panic. And they said, there will be some settling. Well, it settled into a 14 and 23-degree curve and then stuck there.
Yeah.
So,
that's
so
interesting.
crazy.
And
I call it frozen asymmetry.
yeah, but for the rest of
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Carlyn. Or sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, going back, Martha, to kind of, you use the word facing, but we've also said like staying curious. And I think that's been really, I'm naturally a curious person. And so, it took me a long time. I wasn't, I think I was probably in my early 30s when I got really curious about my scoliosis and spinal fusion. And I got real curious, like in depth, real fast. But it's a good thing to be curious. Like, it's a good thing to be curious about your x-ray. It's a good thing to be curious and mindful, like listening and in tune to what's happening. Because, Julie, you've also talked about how, things change. And that's a good thing. Like, things change, our movement practices change. And if we're listening carefully and staying curious, hopefully we stay on a good path for the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, but I use the word face it, because I guess it does have a sort of a more of a challenging connotation to it. But it's that it was kind of a wake-up call to understand the amount of resilience I'd had, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So there was also that, like, it was kind of like, holy moly, I had to go through a lot. Not every teenager goes through all those different procedures. And so, yeah, face it, because I didn't want to really know what had happened. But then once I really thought it through and reflected on it and started looking at the x-rays and started really thinking about how I feel inside physically and as well emotionally, with all the memories of what had happened, it wasn't just a one-day experience of remembering, right? It was months and years of overcoming the different layers of, I'm going to say layers of trauma, layers of experience, layers of procedures. And then also, now I feel like in the evolution and unfolding of everything that we continue to discover, those layers are still with me, but I'm able to recognize them as part of the building blocks that have brought me to a better place now. but I wouldn't say that it was easy to see it all at the beginning. It was quite difficult. It was very emotional, and it was a long stretch before I was kind of able to absorb it and integrate it all to a place where I could see it as a positive, curious thing. So I just want to give a vote out there for anyone who struggles a bit. I think there's a real struggle there for a lot of us.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I am curious if you all have a favorite yoga pose or asana, or if you have a favorite yoga prop. What's your favorites? I'll tell you mine, because I definitely have a favorite. I really enjoy downward dog with either the ropes at my hip crease so that I get a little bit of lengthening. So that being said, I think that my favorite prop is probably a rope wall. I really like an Iyengar rope wall a lot.
Oh yeah, and Iyengar, I have one everywhere I go because I take my portable one with me. Yeah, no, that's probably a lifesaver. The pelvic swing.
Do you like the pelvic swing? Do you have a favorite pose in it, Martha?
Down dog for sure, but
mine was down dog too.
Yeah, down dog with the pelvic swing.
Just down dog. See, I'm more of a mover and less of a static holder. So I get into down dog and do many variations of down dog and in and out of plank and child's pose to down dog. But you just can't, down dog. It just does everything.
It does. Yeah. There's so many actions in that pose. I love it.
Right.
This is so funny to me because that is like my least favorite pose. It's like
perfect. I'm thrilled to hear that because we are all different.
Your fusion is longer than any of ours, I believe. Maybe. I'm not sure about Martha's, but isn't that right to L4?
L1 to L4. So mine's just the lower half.
Yeah, I wonder if that is what is that.
I get like so in my head. I get like really insecure and like I use my yoga blocks to raise the floor up a little bit for me. So like I can do it, but I just, for whatever reason, I don't know why I've made that like the standard of like how to do things correctly. But I think I probably need to get these ropes that you guys are talking about. Because when I use the ropes in Nancy's class, it takes some of the, I don't want to say some of the work out of it, but I think it just provides that right assistance to maybe quiet some of that noise.
So what is your favorite pose?
My favorite.
Okay. I was just going to say that the other, by the way, I'm infused from T6 to L3. I never did say that earlier. It's true. So it's like about 10 vertebra. And it's thoracic lumbar, right thoracic lumbar. Those little scoliosis pads, the little mini cushions, the little pillows, I found those to be also a game changer because it's so much less fussy than the washcloths or rugs. Do you know about those? The ones Sam and Kaya was selling them, and now I make them. It's my new little side. My side hustle is making little scoliosis pads. They're just little mini cushions. Mm-hmm. I can grab one in a minute and show you. And so then you put those under places that feel like they need a little extra support.
Okay. And Julie, thank you for mentioning. Like, I think it is good for me to remember, like, my fusion might be contributing to why I might be frustrated, and that's a good thing so that I can, one, get to a place of acceptance and then make it so that it is more accessible to me.
Yeah. Right. Do you have a favorite pose, Carlyn?
I do. So it changes. But right now, my favorite pose is tree pose. I always feel really strong and like rooted. And I just bring my foot to my calf. I've always done it that way. And I feel like powerful in that pose.
Yeah, I love that because it speaks to that yoga is not just a physical practice. It's affecting our emotional health as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I will say oftentimes when I teach down dog, I teach it initially with a softness in the back of the knees, especially when people have longer fusions through the lumbar and sacrum.
Yes.
In case that's ever helpful. On the knees. It's okay.
Bent knee variation.
Yeah. Even on the rope wall, I'll teach it that way.
And maybe I could also say that my favorite evolutionary exercise or pose was simply learning how to deep breathe, right? So I mentioned earlier that I was not able to expand my ribs for a long time. They didn't move. They were completely stuck because of the scar tissue. And I didn't know the difference, right? That's just how I'd been for 21 years. But it wasn't until I released after the rod removal that I was like, I took a deep breath for the first time in years and realized like, okay, this is important to be able to fill my ribs and fill my lungs. And then through yoga for scoliosis, and it's a big part of Schroth therapy that I've dabbled in a little bit, is filling up the balloons in the ribs area, filling up the waist and the concave area, finding the breath in a way that really opens the torso and lets the ribs do their accordion the best possible. So that they can support the movement of the side body, even if we're stiff. But it also calms down the nervous system. And we're all pretty wired in this world. And then folks with fusions are extra wired because we have so much going on in our spine where all our nerves are. So I feel that to learn to calm your body down through deep breathing is important just for lifestyle. And then it supports all your activities in yoga, in all your body work, in everything you do, as well as supporting the actual curvature and support of the ribs and waist area. So it's kind of an extra special technique to just learn that slow, deep breathing, not just regular, just little breaths, but really slow meditation breathing.
And Martha, I just wanted to add one thing to that. I'm so glad you brought this up because it was in Yoga for Scoliosis. There was one pose, and I can't really remember exactly what it was, but there was a lot of setup for it. And you just kind of like relaxed into it. And I started tearing up because I would never say I struggled to breathe. But in this pose, my body was in a position that it was so easy and effortless to breathe in deeply that I was like moved by it. It changed the way that I realized how there is kind of more going on just from like that day to day. So yeah, getting into that, just filling in those lungs and being in a posture that allows you to do that is, I think it's really important for our health.
Yeah.
And we talked about the good days and the bad days. And I think when there's bad days and there's a lot of discomfort, we tend to get very contracted in our systems, in our bodies. We don't breathe as deeply and we kind of hold ourselves to get through whatever we have to get through. And I think I lived like that for years at a time without even knowing it, just to kind of survive and I'm okay kind of thing. But once I started to let the breath come in and the release happen, a lot of things come in then. There's time to feel more. There's time to sense more. There's time to think more and reflect more. And in general, that kind of meditative state it can take you into is going to allow all those emotions to flow that also could be contracted inside of that tightness, that tightness of survival and making it through the day, making it past the pain. That's, I think, a very common thing with people with scoliosis and fusion is that they're kind of struggling, but not necessarily recognizing how much they're struggling. So,
yeah, good point.
To give yourself the time to relax can only help. Yeah.
I'm going to take a question here. First, I'm going to share a comment about, I do think it's interesting what people are told post-fusion. So Lady Dean was told no horseback riding or roller coasters. And it's interesting because I was released for all activities except for horseback riding after 6 months. And then after a year, I was released to do some horseback riding. But again, I think that may depend upon the age of when you have the fusion and how long the fusion is.
And your doctor's temperament.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And for me, roller coasters, I was always allowed to do. I used to love them when I was a kid. And now as an adult, it's too much jarring. I do not enjoy a roller coaster ride.
Well, Jen, I had this very optimistic young doctor, and I really appreciate that, actually, at least for the first 15 years of my life, because I'm not sure I would have done the things that I did had I not had a surgeon that said, you're good, go off, do anything you want to do, except don't ski jump. Ski jump? Ski jump?
In Alabama? That's funny.
No trampolines. But he was, because he saw so many orthopedic injuries in general, that was he was across the board, no trampolines, because he saw so many fractures. But, you know, it turns out as there are a lot more things like roller coasters I will not do, and horseback riding I did, but will not do. So as we age, I call it retiring things. And it's some of those things that have been sad to let go of. But, you know, I'm thinking about my 90-year-old spine, and I'm not sure trampolines and roller coasters and horseback riding is going to preserve that spine.
Right.
So.
I also read once, I think it was in the New York Times, it was just about aging in general. And if it's possible, having this perspective of as certain doors close, that allows time for other opportunities and time to spend exploring different things. And so I try to think of that now, like, okay, well, I'm not doing that, but now I can do all these other things because there's...
Yeah, well, I was going to say, an orthopedist told me one time that he saw severe scoliosis. It tended to be young athletic women. Young athletic women. And in my experience, I have found that a lot of us have gymnastics, dance, some form of athletic background. Maybe it's the natural hypermobility or something. And so for a lot of us, in fact, I'm hearing it from all of you that have spoken, it was very hard, especially as a child. Like, I was a gymnast, you guys were dancers, the two of you, to lose that, the movement and the way of exploring and being in the body. And I think that comes back to yoga. When I figured out that this could be something I could do, was a movement practice. I could actually be in my body again. And I am a body-centered person. I want to experience the world through my physical body. And now it's just figuring out how to do that well. You know, for the long term. So
I wanted to share my restrictions with you guys, what I was told.
Yes.
I was told no bungee jumping, no skydiving, and never see a chiropractor. And I totally saw a chiropractor.
And I did go skydiving.
You did?
Whoa.
Yeah, and it wasn't, the hardest part is that you're in that prone position. I think I just lost my camera there. You know, when you're skydiving, but the landing is like stepping off a curb. I mean, it's just like a very soft, you think it's going to be a jarring landing. I guess it could be. Fortunately, my experience was soft, but.
So interesting.
Yeah, it has to do, I think it relates to what people want to do too, right? So I wanted to dance so badly, even though I was told not to. I found a way to do it. And thank God I did, because it was through dance that I discovered the world of body work and the world of physicality that is way beyond just, you know, jump, kick, turn. And it allowed me to keep jumping and kicking and turning for a while. But over the years, I've had to retire that because it's I basically overworked in a crooked way one knee for a little bit too long, which is something I'm struggling with now. But that is understandable. With age, everybody tends to get some issues with some joints somewhere along the way. And if you're working on them crooked, then you better be paying attention to that. But I was told absolutely no horseback riding, no trampoline. Those were the two main ones. Like absolutely never, ever do that. But then also don't go to phys ed, don't do any group athletics, and don't do any sports except for swimming, walking, and skiing. I was allowed to ski, which I thought, well, was okay if you're on the bunny hill, but it's not always a great idea to recommend skiing if you don't know what you're doing, because skiing can be dangerous, especially if you fall and lose control. But yeah, growing up in BC with mountains, I guess that was something they felt I should still be able to do. But I did try trampolining because, of course, you want to as a kid, and it was so uncomfortable. I didn't need to ever try that again. I met somebody recently in their 70s who has a long fusion and has done horseback riding their entire life. They are still horseback riding now because that's what they've always done. So she's questioning whether she should continue doing it. But I'm like, well, you've had a really good ride, so maybe you don't need to keep doing it. But because it's always been part of her life, I suppose it was okay for her, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were already a very athletic young person, or like me, I was dancing so much, or like Jen, then maybe it was more possible for me to keep dancing because I already had that in my body. However, I arguably overdid some of it because that's what dancers do. So I
think it's interesting, like how we condition our bodies when we're younger. So like I've never been a runner, and I think that I think it might be possible to run with a spinal fusion, but I'm not going to go learn how to run. My body's not conditioned to do that. It's not the right thing for me. But I do think how we conditioned, or what our body, and I don't mean conditioned like as in like in shape. I mean conditioned as like what forces our body was used to before fusion and when we were young, even post fusion. For those of us who are fused younger, that does affect, I think, what feels right as we, move on in life, like you're saying, Martha.
Yeah, so desire, your will and desire too. Like I know somebody who comes from a tennis family. Their entire family is about tennis and competitive tennis and teaching tennis. And if she didn't play tennis, then she couldn't really participate with her family. And so it has caused her trouble, but she is determined to keep playing tennis no matter what. And that is what keeps her doing her yoga, actually, so that she can keep playing her tennis.
Yeah, I mean, I think finding, joy and love in the ways you move is really important.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put up one other question here.
I'm just going to grab one thing.
So Elise is asking if any of us work with spondylolisthesis post-fusion, and how is that different? So I think there's a few things in this question. First, a spondylolisthesis is when the vertebral body above, or like when the vertebral bodies shift. They can shift forward or they can shift back. And they can happen, a spondylolisthesis can happen in different ways. And if anyone wants to, I'm just trying to define a spondy here. So there's a shifting.
When she says post-fusion, is this occurring under the fusion?
That's what I'm wondering, Elise, is this happening below your fusion point? Is it like the next segment below your fusion, or is it lower? And I'll answer how I would answer. I think that adjacent segment, of course, it is more at risk for taking extra movement. And I think ideally what we can do is unload it and then stabilize. And it's an interesting question because it's also, how is it different? So I personally, now this is a change in how I work with my own body, but I try very, very hard below and above the fusion to stabilize. It makes me feel much better. So there may be some things for someone who has a spondy that don't feel right, but I think for how I teach, generally there might not be much difference just in focusing on what is happening right below the fusion, because I tend to teach in a more stable, neutral spine way.
I agree with you, Jen.
Yeah, go for it, Julie. Answer, add on.
The same answer. If I had somebody coming to me with this, I would err on the side of teaching neutral spine in various postures and working on stabilizing and strengthening around that particular area. That would be my approach for that. And to be careful of not over mobilizing that unfused area. But like you said, that's my general approach now with long fusions anyway, is to not over mobilize the unfused areas.
Yeah, and I'm a short fusion, and I do not want to over mobilize my lumbar. I mean, I did that for a long time, but now because that lumbar curve is unfused, and I do not want it to be pressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Martha,
I
do you
would
have
agree
any?
with that. I would agree with that, but I would also really encourage anybody with any kind of, well, it's good for everybody, but especially with the lower unfused segment, to play with diagonals, okay? Because we have a fusion down the middle of our body, and we have a stiffness in the middle of our body with the hardware. There's, perhaps scar tissue, there's a scar. And so we often work front and back and straight spine, but in my somatic yoga, I've started to really play with and enjoy the sensation of diagonals. So you just lying flat on the floor to feel one shoulder and the opposite hip. Breathe into that. One shoulder and the opposite hip. Breathe into that. I mean, that's like the 101 version, but just developing that awareness of across the body can really awaken new stabilization. So I'm sure that all the stabilizing that you do already is fantastic. And yet this diagonal stabilization is something that I avoided, I think, just because of that sense of stiffness in the middle. And reawakening that has allowed me a whole new, let's say, clarity in my pelvic area and my hip area, which has been very confused for a very long time. And I think that that's a source of a lot of issues for people because our hips do tend to be crooked and twisted. So I'm going crooked and twisted. So then you get kind of a diagonal approach, and there's something that's lengthening in new ways across that, and can often kind of stabilize and recalibrate the hips. So
Great.
That's a suggestion which could be explored.
Yeah. I find that diagonals can be super, super helpful. I think I probably teach them a little bit more when I'm teaching Pilates, but also it all starts to kind of come together sometimes.
Overlap. Yeah.
Yeah. It overlaps.
It's funny, they don't really talk about diagonals in yoga per se. Not specifically, although they're all the way through it, of course. It's constantly in all our body movement. It's just that specific awareness across the fusion that I found, like, oh, right, you're allowed to go across it.
Yeah. Okay. So Elise did clarify. So this is a different question. So it sounds as though the fusion is L4, L5 to correct a spondy.
Correct.
So it's a little bit different than what I initially assumed. And yeah, Julie, do you want to take this? I can also.
She's not a scoliosis.
I don't believe so from reading this.
And I have had clients with 1 or 2 level low fusions. They do really well therapeutically, and if the spondy's been corrected with the fusion, it's just like working with any other fused area. I, in this case, would mobilize above the fusion since her entire thoracic is unfused. She's got all that mobility and no scoliosis. So you've got a good bit of normal movement. It really depends, again, what the goals are. The goals to go to a yoga class and make that work for her, or the goals to, is she having pain? It's kind of just need more information.
Yeah, and I think I agree because everyone is so different.
The word fusion, it's not a generic. We're talking, if you're long fusion, short fusion, 1 level fusion, those, and then just people fused to the sacrum look completely different than how I look fused T3 to L3. So you just got big variations with the levels of fusion.
Right.
Someone like this, you would never know they were fused. Generally, when I see them in a yoga class, you would never see any mobility. You wouldn't even notice the mobility challenge, hardly.
Right. And depending upon pain level, I might be a little bit more conscientious about stabilizing L3 to L4 because that can tend to be an unstabilized area, and it's right above that fusion, and then stabilizing L5 to sacrum. So lumbopelvic stability is also confusing for everyone, but especially I think having just a short fusion right there, I would still look at those areas above and below, and then also maybe the thoracolumbar stability, just still focusing, I would suggest, on stabilizing and keeping the spine strong, but also knowing that, yeah, you can do some mobilization with like the
But
thoracic.
stability, you can't go wrong with stabilizing.
Exactly. I agree. I fully agree.
If you just go to that, you know, when you're not sure, especially when you're first working with someone and trying to get a sense for them, just stabilize and strengthen and then kind of go from there.
Yeah.
Stabilize first.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all of our questions. Thank you all so much.
I wanted to just show the scoliosis pads. So they're just little tiny cushions that you can just, they're just so convenient to just put under places that need a little support. So if anyone has any questions about those, I can hook you up.
Amazing. Okay. Have a great weekend.
Thank you for doing that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. It was really nice to meet you both and talk about this more. So thank you for the opportunity.
We should do a follow-up. I'm sure we have more to say.
Yeah,
I'd like that.
so
Yeah.
much. Okay, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I really appreciate it, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jen.